Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. With everything going on south of the border regarding the peaceful transition of power, I thought I'd take a look at how this differs in Canada somewhat, particularly because the United States system fuses the head of state and the head of government, whereas in Canada they are separate individuals. In Canada, the head of state is obviously our sovereign, the Queen, who is represented in the country by the Governor General, and the head of government is the Prime Minister. And that has a very different dynamic in terms of how these things tend to happen. So there is no, big elaborate ceremony when it comes to the transition of power. Really, in any of the cases in Canada, barring coronation, but that's a separate story altogether. But when it comes to, for example, after an election and a new prime minister is chosen, we don't have the same kind of pomp and circumstance and ceremony and everything that happens in the American system. It's much more business-like in a Westminster system because we don't have the same kind of status for the prime minister. The prime minister is the head of government. He or she is not the symbol of everything that is in the country. That rests with the Queen and to an extent the Governor General. So that has a very different aspect to it. There's no military parades. There's no none of that kind of stuff that goes on in the American process, and that's, I think, an important distinction. We keep these things separate in Canada for a reason. In part so that there's a balancing act in terms of who has power and who exercises it. And, the Crown has the power but doesn't exercise it, and the government, being the Prime Minister and Cabinet, kind of borrow the power from the Crown and exercise it but don't actually hold it themselves. And that's one of those kinds of things that makes our system interesting and I think possibly a little more responsive and a little less prone to some of the kinds of cults of personality that can develop in, systems where your head of state and head of government are more properly fused like they are. So, for example, post-election in Canada, it's a swearing-in ceremony for the new Prime Minister and Cabinet at Rideau Hall, being the residence of the Governor General. And it's a very, very, business-like affair. You have the new cabinet and usually their families with them, and they come up and they read the oaths and sign them, and that's it. There's no real symbolism or anything attached to that, and that's again in keeping with the fact that this is the head of government. It's not the head of state. When we had a transition of Governor General, there is a little more pomp and ceremony associated with that, but not again to the same degree. If the last one was much to go by, it's a ceremony that takes place in the Senate because the Senate is the chamber in Parliament which deals with the Crown. The Crown is not allowed in the House of Commons for various historical reasons. So it takes place in the Senate, and it's mostly about speeches and signing some oaths. But that's largely what it entails. It's not, again, there's no symbolic trappings that tend to be associated with it in the same way. And that's, again, owing to kind of how our system is a bit more workmanlike in that regard. Now, the big exception to this is a coronation, and most of us have not seen one in our lifetimes because the Queen has been on the throne for nearly 70 years now. So But that's, what the next kind of major turnover would be is when the unfortunate time happens and she passes and Charles takes the throne. That's when we'll see a lot more of the pageantry and so on that is associated with that changing of a head of state. And given the long reign of Her Majesty, that's kind of kept that out of the public eye in Canadian and Commonwealth circles particularly. But that's kind of what some of those differences are. Another couple of things that are somewhat of interest is that there is no there's no need for an outgoing prime minister to kind of be there and congratulate the incoming one during a swearing-in ceremony. The outgoing one doesn't usually attend, and there's no ceremonial handoff in any way. Really, that kind of happens behind the scenes when the outgoing prime minister formally submits his or her resignation to the Governor General, and then the new prime minister is sworn in almost immediately thereafter. There's very little actual gap in terms of when the formal resignation happens and the new prime minister is sworn in. I think the last time was about an hour gap. And that's largely also because our system depends on the Governor General or the Crown getting advice from a government. And that's why we always need to have basically a prime minister in power so that advice can be given to the Crown, which exercises the power, well, not exercises, which holds the power that the government is exercising. That also has to play in with kind of a transition of government. So post-election usually, but sometimes it's a little after, given situations of non-confidence and so on. But when a prime minister loses confidence, that is when he or she will tell the Governor General their intention to resign, and that's when the next prime minister is invited to start forming a government, and there's a transition period of a few weeks when they kind of make that happen. It's less involved in Canada than in the US because we have a permanent civil service in here that goes all the way up to the deputy minister level. Whereas in the US, political appointments go much further down into their own civil service. And that takes a lot longer and involves much more briefings, and also has created the think tank ecosystem in Washington as well, where the people kind of swap in and out from when their party is not in power. So that's another one of those kinds of differences in terms of how that transition happens between our different forms of government. As well, ours is less regimented, and we don't have, it happens on this date every 4 years kind of thing. That doesn't happen here either because of our much more fluid system around confidence. And even with fixed election dates, as terrible as they are, they don't necessarily impart any kind of fixed timelines for a transition were one to happen. So that's kind of an overview of some of the differences in our systems and how these work. I hope that's interesting and insightful as we observe this process going on in the States. And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, that's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.